If you're using Tailwind CSS with VS Code, you might not be taking full advantage of the various tools and features that can help make working with Tailwind CSS even easier. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to optimize your Tailwind setup inside of VS Code so that you can write your Tailwind CSS styles faster, more efficiently, and make your overall development experience even smoother. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Now, before we get started, there are a couple prerequisites in order to follow along with this video. Now, if you're using Tailwind CSS, I'm assuming you already have a basic understanding of HTML and CSS fundamentals. And specifically in the case of Tailwind, we want to understand how to style our elements using CSS classes. It's also going to be helpful if you understand the basics of Tailwind, things like how to install it, how the utility classes work, so on and so forth. Now, with that said, we are going to be building a project from scratch in this video, so you're more than welcome to follow along, even if you're brand new to Tailwind. Now, like the title of this video suggests, I'm going to be using VS Code exclusively throughout this video, and we're going to be looking at a few of the various tools and features that we can add into VS Code to get the most out of our Tailwind experience. And finally, if you want to take a look at the code that I am using in this video, it's going to be helpful if you have an understanding of Git and GitHub, as all of the source code will be hosted up on my GitHub repository, which you can get at the URL listed in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and there's also a link down in the description below. Now, if you need help with anything listed here, I do have videos on every single one of these topics, which you can also find links to down in the description. All right, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and see how we can use Tailwind CSS inside of VS Code. So like I mentioned earlier, we are going to be building this project from scratch. So what we're going to do is go ahead and create a new Tailwind project using Vite, and then we're going to install and use a few of the various Tailwind CSS extensions that are available in VS Code. And specifically, we're going to use the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense extension, which is the official extension from Tailwind. We're also going to use another extension called Tailwind CSS Docs, which is going to give us quick access to the Tailwind documentation from directly inside of VS Code. And if you've ever used Tailwind CSS in the past, you'll know that your HTML can look pretty ugly as you start adding Tailwind classes. So we're going to take advantage of another extension called Tailwind CSS Fold, which will allow us to collapse the HTML class attribute directly inside of VS Code. Now, I'll also add chapters to this video, so if you want to skip around and see the various extensions, you should be able to see that down at the bottom of the video or down in the description. But now that we know what we're going to build, let's go ahead and start creating our project. All right, to get started, what I'm going to do is go ahead and open up a terminal, and I'm going to use this to go ahead and scaffold my new project using Vite. And so after we've done that, we can do everything else from within VS Code, but I need to go ahead and create that project first. So to do that, let's go ahead and open up a terminal, and I like to keep all my projects in a folder called code. So I'll go ahead and cd into my code directory. And then what I'm going to do is use Vite to go ahead and scaffold this project. And to do that, it's pretty simple. What we need to do is type npm create and then Vite at latest. All right, and what this will do is this will run the Vite creation utility. It's asking me if I want to install the following packages. So create Vite at 6.3.1, which I do. And it's going to ask me what I want my project name to be. So I'm going to call this Tailwind VS Code. Go ahead and hit enter. And then it's going to ask me what framework that I want to use. So this is one of the cool things about using Vite is you can scaffold all kinds of different projects. I'm just going to use vanilla JavaScript for this demo since it's going to be pretty simple. Then don't really need TypeScript, so I'm just going to make it just plain JavaScript. And you can see that it has scaffolded my project inside of a folder called Tailwind VS Code. So I'm going to go ahead and cd into that now. So cd Tailwind VS Code, and then I'm going to run npm install to install the dependencies. And then once that's done, I can go ahead and open this up in Visual Studio Code by typing code docs. So that will open the current directory inside of Visual Studio Code. And you can see we have a project scaffolded here. We have our package.json. Our name of our project is Tailwind VS Code. Our dev dependency is Vite. So Vite is going to be serving as our build tool and our server for this demo. And then we have an index.html with a div with an ID of app, along with a script tag that is loading this main.js. If we go into that file, we can see that there is some boilerplate code in here. So what we're going to do now is just remove all of this boilerplate code because we're going to be focusing on the very basics of using these Tailwind extensions. So let's go ahead and get rid of everything here. So I'm going to basically get rid of the ID of app. I'll go ahead and leave my script tag the same because I am going to need the script tag, but inside of the main.js, I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of everything that's in here except for my style.css. And then inside of my style CSS, I'm actually going to get rid of everything in here. So I'm just highlight everything, go ahead and remove it, make sure I save all of these files. I don't need any of these starter files, this counter or this JavaScript file. So go ahead and delete those. Inside of the public folder, I don't need the Vite logo. Go ahead and delete that. And inside of my index.html, I'm just going to add an h1 in here that says hello world. Now inside of VS Code, I can open up the VS Code integrated terminal by pressing Ctrl-tilde, and I can go ahead and run this project now. So we'll say npm run dev, which is the start script for Vite. And once I've done that, go ahead and click this to open it. And there we go. So we have a basic HTML page that says hello world. And so what we're going to do is install Tailwind and then use some of the Tailwind CSS classes to move this into the center, create a YouTube looking subscribe button. And while we're doing that, we're going to go ahead and explore the various extensions that we can use to make this workflow even easier. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and install and configure Tailwind. So to do that, let's go ahead and go down into the terminal and we'll say npm install, and we want Tailwind CSS. And then we also want the Tailwind CSS plugin for Vite, which is at Tailwind CSS /Vite. Go ahead and hit enter. All right, and so once those are installed, what we need to do is go ahead and create a viteconfig.js file since it doesn't exist already. So we'll click into the open area to make sure we're on the root, click to create a new file, and we'll call this vite.config.js. And then inside of this file, we need to import two different things. One is going to be the define config method, which is the Vite configuration. So let's go ahead and import, and this is going to be in curly braces, define config from Vite. And then we also want to import the Tailwind plugin. So we'll say import Tailwind CSS from Tailwind CSS /Vite. You can see that Visual Studio Code is helping me out here. All right, the next thing that we want to do is export a call to that define config method. So we'll say export defaults define config. All right, and inside of that is going to be an object, and that object is going to have a plugins property, which is going to be an array. And then what we need to do is go ahead and call this Tailwind CSS method to configure the plugin. So we'll say Tailwind CSS, open and close parentheses, and we should be good to go here. All right, so the last thing that we need to do in order to make this work is go into our style.css file, so our main CSS for our application, and import Tailwind CSS. So we do that using an @import, and then in quotes, it's going to be Tailwind CSS. All right, and if we've done everything correctly, we can go ahead and launch our dev server again. So we'll say npm run dev. Open this up, and you can see that we have different styling here, which means Tailwind is being loaded into our application. And to confirm this, I can go ahead and right click and click inspect, and then I can go into the sources tab. We can see the sources for my application. And if I click into source and then click style.css, you can see there's not much in here because we're not really doing anything yet. So let's go ahead and start working with our Tailwind CSS classes. All right, so back here in VS Code, I have my index.html open. And like I mentioned previously, what we want to do is go ahead and take this hello world and center it directly in the middle of the screen. And then we're also going to create a YouTube looking subscribe button to put underneath it. Now, in order to achieve this, I need to essentially use some flexbox and CSS to get that desired result. And I can tap into that with Tailwind CSS classes. So I know since I've used Tailwind CSS before that in order to do that, I need to first set the height of the body element to 100% of the viewport height, which I can do using a class of h-screen. But notice I'm not getting any suggestions, any IntelliSense, basically anything at all to let me know that I'm doing things correctly. So that's where our first extension, which is the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin, comes in. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and go over to my extensions panel, and then inside of the search box, I'm going to search for Tailwind. And the first extension that should pop up is going to be this Tailwind CSS IntelliSense, which is the official extension from Tailwind. And so if I click on this, we can see a little bit more information about what this does. And basically you can see some of the details here, the installation. It gives us some autocomplete. You can see some of the things that it does here in the screenshots. Gives us some linting. So if we type things wrong that are incorrect in certain parts of Tailwind, it'll go ahead and lint those. Also gives us some hover preview about what those classes actually do, which is pretty cool. So there's a few other things in here. We're not going to go into that much detail. So let's go ahead and install the extension and see what it can do for us. So now that the extension is installed, one thing I want to point out is in this installation, it does mention that you need to have a Tailwind config file. Now in newer versions of Tailwind, they've actually moved away from that config, and the goal is to really have the configuration inside of the CSS itself. And so what I've noticed with this extension is if you're using Tailwind version 4, you actually don't need this. So once you've installed the extension, you might need to restart VS Code in order for things to kick in. But once everything is installed and good, you can see that if I go back into my HTML, I can hover over this H screen and it is telling me exactly what this does. So you can see that H screen sets the height of that element to 100 VH, which is 100% of the viewport height. You can also see that if I kind of backspace into this, you can see that I'm also getting IntelliSense telling me all the various Tailwind classes that I can use, which is pretty cool. And so now that I have that, I can go ahead and finish setting up my body tag so that it will center any content directly in the middle of the page. So let's go ahead and finish this up. So once I have 100% of the viewport height, then I can go ahead and set this to a flex container by adding the flex class. And then once this is a flex container, I can go ahead and center things in the middle of the element by using items center, which you can see sets the align items property to center. And then we also want to set the justify to center. So this is going to give us horizontal and vertical centering. And then the last thing we want to do is change the background from that white background that we have. So let's go ahead and set it to something else. Let's make it darker. So we'll say BG. Let's go ahead and see what kind of grays we have. So I say gray, and I want a pretty dark gray. So let's go ahead and go with the 900 here. All right, and you can see that this is a lot more user-friendly than having to essentially remember those classes off the top of our head and typing them in manually. So we get some autocomplete, we get some IntelliSense, we get information about what this actually does, which is pretty cool. And so this is the power of the official Tailwind extension inside of VS Code. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like currently. Let's go ahead and launch our dev server again. So we'll say npm run dev, and you can see that now we have our hello world centered in the middle of the screen. Now we can't see it because the text is too dark. So let's go ahead and jump back over to VS Code, and let's go ahead and just set the text color of this to white. So we'll say class equals and then text white. There we go. And so now we can see that that says hello world. Now having the IntelliSense is helpful inside of VS Code, and knowing what those properties do is also very helpful, but it would be nice if we had some quick access to the Tailwind documentation. So that way we could look up the classes that are available to us and the different ways that we can use them. And so for that, we're going to go ahead and install another extension, which is called Tailwind Docs. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and go over to the extensions panel, and then up in the search box, search for Tailwind Docs. And it should be this one here by Austin Cameron. And the reason why this is useful is because Tailwind at its core is just CSS. And so if you know CSS, but you're trying to figure out which Tailwind classes map to those CSS properties, we can actually search the docs for those CSS properties and see how we can use those with Tailwind. And so having that access directly in VS Code is super, super helpful. So what we're going to go ahead and do is click install, and you can see what it does. If we shrink this down a little bit, you can see that it says to use the extension, we use the command palette, which is going to be Control-Shift-P, and that's going to open the command palette, which is this one right here, or basically this one here at the top. And then we can search for specific CSS properties, and it will open that documentation directly inside of VS Code, so we can see how to use the associated Tailwind classes. Now, by default, you can see that it's going to open inside of VS Code, but you can change that if you want it to open inside of an external browser. So now that we have the extension installed, let's go back to our HTML and see what we're trying to accomplish here. To access the Tailwind docs, what we can do is press Command-Control-P, and that will open the command palette. We can also just click up here in the command palette box and then click Show and Run Commands, and then that will bring us to the same spot. But since we're going to be using the keyboard shortcut tends to work a little bit better. And once we have this open, we can just start typing Tailwind, and we can see that there's all kinds of information in here for Tailwind docs. So you can see accent color, align items, align self, and so these typically are the CSS properties that you would normally use inside of a CSS file. And by clicking on one of these, let's just go down to border width, for example. Let's say we wanted to set the border width. So if we go ahead and click on this, it's going to open up the border width inside of the Tailwind documentation. And you can see that it will tell us the different Tailwind classes that we can use to add those borders. So using the class of border, we'll add a border width of 1. So let's go ahead and just try this out to see what it looks like. So on the H1, let's go ahead and just add the border class. You can see that the IntelliSense is also telling us what this does. Let's go ahead and save this and then jump back to our browser. And you can see now that we have a little box, a 1 pixel border around our element. And so we can do this with any CSS property that we're looking for. So this gives us very quick access to that documentation. So that way we don't have to jump back and forth between the Tailwind documentation and VS Code. So let's go ahead and remove the border. All right, and so what I want to do now is go ahead and change the font weight of this to make it a little bit bolder. And I also want to make the font size a little bit larger. So let's go ahead and see how we can do this using the Tailwind docs. So if I go ahead and press Command-Shift-P, I can open this up, and I'll go ahead and type in Tailwind, and then the font weight is the first one I'm looking for. So I'll just type in font, and we can see down here at the bottom font weight. So let's go ahead and click this. So since I want a bolder font, I can see, there is a class here for font bold, and this is going to set the font weight to 700. So let's go ahead and jump back to my index.html, and I'll go ahead and just add font bold here. Go ahead and save that, jump back to the browser so we can see what it looks like. All right, so we have a bold font here. And now I want to change the size, which is going to be font size. So let's go ahead and go back to the Tailwind docs. We'll say Tailwind font size, which is the other property I'm looking for. And we can see, there's a bunch of different classes here. They start with text. So if I want a larger text, I can go ahead and maybe use either large or extra large. So we'll go ahead and go back to our index, and then we'll use the text large class. Go ahead and save that. And we can see that this isn't quite as large as I want it to be. So let's go ahead and go back. Let's do 3XL. Let's try that. There we go. So that looks a lot better. And so we can see that these Tailwind classes don't match up to the CSS properties one-to-one. And so if you know the CSS property that you're trying to change, it makes it very easy to find the associated class inside of the Tailwind documentation. So let's go ahead and see another example of that. Let's go ahead and create a subscribe button underneath this H1. And so we're going to go ahead and just start with a basic button. Let's go ahead and put subscribe. All right. And if we go back to the browser, you can see that we do have a button there, but it has no styling of any sort at all. So let's go ahead and style this to make it look like a YouTube subscribe button. So I already know I can add some classes to this, and I know that I want the background color to at least be red. So I can use the BG-red, and then we'll go ahead and choose one of these red colors here. Let's go ahead and make it 600. And then we also want the text to be white. So we'll use that text white that we used before. And so now that we can see, we're starting to get something that looks a little bit like a button. Now I want to add some padding to the inside of the button. So we'll add some padding, which is going to be PY, and then we'll go ahead and set that to 2. And so that'll be the top and bottom. And then PX, which is the left and right, we'll go ahead and set that to 6. And you can see that having this IntelliSense is super helpful here. Let's go ahead and save that. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Now I want to round the corners here, and the property to do that in CSS is called border radius. But if I go ahead and type in border here, you can see that I don't have like a border radius Tailwind style that I can use. So let's go ahead and refer to the documentation. So let's go ahead and press Shift Control P, and then Tailwind border, and we can see there it is, border radius. So let's go ahead and click on that. And so the classes for Tailwind to use the border radius CSS property is going to be rounded. All right, and if you've ever seen a YouTube subscribe button, it essentially kind of looks like this show less thing right here. So if I scroll all the way to the bottom, we can see that way down at the bottom. Here we go. So basically I'm creating a pill looking button. That's what the YouTube subscribe button looks like. And so it says to use the rounded full utility to create pill buttons. So this is essentially the effect that I'm looking for. So what we can do is go back to our index.html and then go ahead and remove that border because we don't want a border on it. What we want is that rounded full. All right, let's save that and jump back to the browser. And there we go. Now we have a button that looks quite a bit more like the YouTube subscribe button. Now I also want to give this a little bit of a drop shadow. So I'll go ahead and say shadow LG. And then when I hover over this, I want to change the background a little bit from this red to a little bit of a darker red. And so to do that, I can use the hover. And then basically when it's in the hover state, we're going to change the background red to 700. All right, so if we go back, now we can see that hovering over that. Now we get a little bit more of the behavior that we expect from a button. And we can enhance this a little further by adding a transition. So let's go ahead and transition this. And basically what that's going to do is fade it between those two different colors of red. And so for that transition, we'll go ahead and set that duration of the transition to be 300 milliseconds. All right, so now if I go back to the button, now you can see that it fades in and out from those two different colors of red whenever I hover over this, which is pretty cool. The other thing I want here is I want a hand cursor when I hover over the button. So let's go ahead and see if there's a cursor class, which there is. And so I want the cursor to be the hand, which is the pointer. Let's see, cursor pointer. There we go. All right, there's my subscribe button with my hand, and this looks pretty good. Now, if you notice, this subscribe button is aligned to the left. I want it to be directly underneath my hello world. So let's go ahead and add a class to my containing div. We'll say class, and then that was going to be the text align property. So we'll just say text center. There we go. And then let's go ahead and add some margin underneath my H1. And I can do that by saying margin bottom MB. And let's go ahead and set that to 2. All right, so that looks pretty good. So hello world, we got a little bit of spacing in between the text and the button. And overall, I think this is looking pretty good. Now, what's not looking pretty good though is my HTML. So this is one of the big downsides of using Tailwind and its utility class-based structure is you essentially end up with HTML with a bunch of classes inside of it, which basically means I don't have to write any CSS at all, which is kind of nice, but it does make my HTML very hard to read and essentially makes it harder to work with. And so what we could do to fix that is use another Tailwind extension called Tailwind Fold. And what that will do is essentially collapse everything that is inside of these class attributes to make our HTML appear a little bit more clean. So that way we can still focus on the structure of our HTML when we need to. So to do that, let's go back over to the extensions panel, and looks like I was still searching for Tailwind Docs. So what I'm going to do now is search for Tailwind Fold, and you can see that's going to be this first one here, which is by Stevo. And you can see if we look at the documentation, we can say goodbye to messy and hard to read HTML code. It will help us improve the readability of the code by automatically folding long class attributes. And so we can see inside of this animation what this does. It basically collapses all of those class attributes, and it collapses anything that's in there. So if you have other classes that you're using that are not Tailwind, it'll collapse those as well. But you can see that gives us a nice readable structure of our HTML. So let's go ahead and install this by clicking install. And then what we can do is toggle the fold using the Control-Alt-A shortcut. So if we go back to our HTML, we can see that it automatically folded all of our classes. And what's cool is I can go ahead and click on it and it will automatically expand it. And then when I click off of it, it'll collapse it. And if I want to toggle everything, I can press Control-Alt-A, which will expand everything, and then Control-Alt-A again to collapse it. Now, if you're on a Mac like I am, the Alt key is going to be the Option key. So it's going to be Control-Option-A, and then on Windows, it's going to be Control-Alt-A. And on a Mac, that is the Control key, not the Command key. So Control-Option-A, expand, Control-Option-A again, collapse. All right, you can see now this is a lot cleaner and easier to work with. And then if I want to, just work on this hello world, I can go ahead and click this, go ahead and work on it as I need to. And then when I click off of that, it'll automatically collapse those. So I have much more readable HTML. And so you can see that by using these three extensions, working with Tailwind is a lot more user-friendly and gives you a lot of tools and features that can help enhance your workflow. And so that is how you can get the most out of Tailwind when using Visual Studio Code. All right, and that is pretty much going to do it for this video on how to use Tailwind inside of Visual Studio Code. If you like this video and found this information valuable, please leave a like down below. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, be sure to leave those down in the comments below. And until next time, be sure to stay curious, never stop learning, and I will see you all in the next video.